Mr. Cropper, I've been sitting on a response for some time, ever since I saw the first of your video posts on hermeneutics. And after some deliberation, I've decided to err on the side of optimism. It's pretty clear to me that, first, you're not particularly familiar with the subject of hermeneutics. This is evidenced by the fact that, first, you're discussing it almost entirely, and I would say largely exclusively, by reading from a Wikipedia page. Your comments, as you offer them, are less on the subject of hermeneutics and more on the subject of postmodern influence, and in such a way that you could be talking about basically anything. You could be discussing hermeneutics, you could be discussing linguistic theory, you could be discussing historical critique, you could be discussing literary theory. Really, you could be talking about basically anything, and these comments would be still roughly applicable because you're not really talking about hermeneutics, you're talking about postmodernism and your objections to it. Second, it's also very evident that you're unaccustomed to speaking in an academic context when you are not the only adult in the room. The format of reading aloud a text, which is available to the rest of the class, and then interjecting occasional comment or exposition, is entirely appropriate when, for example, you're discussing American history in a room full of 9-year-olds, but is not particularly appropriate when you are discussing 20th century philosophy with at least the stated intent of addressing adults. As I mentioned, I don't think you're really talking about hermeneutics. Your comments regarding hermeneutics, and in point of fact, all of the comments, all of the moments in this video and in this series of videos wherein you are using your own words, you're not really discussing the subject at hand. So if you are, as I think you are, using hermeneutics exclusively as a platform for discussing postmodernism and its influence on various intellectual or academic disciplines, we would hope to find you reasonably knowledgeable on postmodernism, and yet here I also have to say that I find myself disappointed. You juxtapose ideas that are completely incompatible and have no correlation to postmodernism. For example, you string Kant and subjectivism together at the same time. For that matter, you also string subjectivism and relativism together, as if they were interchangeable. You freely call yourself an objectivist, and yet you deride Kant. I'm not entirely sure how you can do this, except perhaps as a result of an absolute unfamiliarity with both actual objectivism, that being the tradition of objectivism, the taxonomy associated with it, the disciplines and major contributors to objectivism, and, for that matter, just the general framework of what the word objectivism means in a philosophical context. It seems evident, just in your use of the word, that your exposure is almost exclusively through Rand. Now, Rand is what we would like to call an appropriator. Rand was very fond of taking terms that she herself did not originate and applying completely different definitions to them. An objectivist is not a materialist, necessarily. An objectivist is not an empiricist, necessarily. An objectivist is certainly not a positivist, necessarily. And as you use the word objectivism in a context where these three things are implied, you implicitly state that an objectivist is a materialist, is an empiricist, and is a positivist. I can understand your discomfort with subjectivism, with Kantianism, or for that matter, with the bulk of Western thought in regards to the problems of the object-subject relationship in any perceptual or knowledge problem, as you have some evident difficulty with postmodernism, whether that difficulty is purely a personal distaste or a well-reasoned and well-argued position of objection. You do have some difficulty with it. So just for the sake of clarification, we need to get a few things straight. First, postmodernism is not a position, per se. There is no definitive postmodernist interpretation. There is no definitive set of postmodernist predicates. Postmodernism issues no assertions, proposes no methods, and relies on no specific predicates. What we would generally dub postmodernism is simply an observation or commentary on the breakdowns of the modernist paradigm. The irony being that those comments actually predate modernism as an identifiable trend in Western thought. If we consider the postmodernist philosopher to be those who would argue against the totality of knowledge, or rather the specific applicability of empiricism as a solution to all possible problems, then we can go as far back as Aquinian logic and say that that is postmodernist, which would be rather silly of us. It would be rather silly to say that the postmodern era began in the 12th century. But this, in a way, highlights the essence of the postmodern problem, or rather the problems with modernism. That being that even before its inception, as a discrete and discernibly identifiable trend in Western thought, the problems of modernism, the problems of empiricism were evident, were thoroughly commented, were thoroughly illustrated. The postmodern era is not so much a realization that modernism has problems. It's more a realization that modernism, strictly speaking, was never viable to begin with, and that we knew so from the beginning. Postmodernism is not a new trend in Western thought. It is not a corruption. It is not even really a response to modernism itself. It is more the stirrings in the Western world from slumber. The stirrings wherein we seek to at least begin to shake off those soft, cottony moorings of dream that would bind us into delusion. In this case, a delusion regarding what can and cannot be absolutely known, and the ways in which we can and cannot gain true knowledge. Now, on initial exposure to this concept, initial exposure to the problems of the modernist paradigm, Heidegger, for example, and his hammer. And incidentally, I loathe Heidegger. I loathe Heidegger because he's right. I wish he wasn't. I genuinely wish he wasn't. But he is. Our ability to manipulate things and gain knowledge of things through our manipulation of them really only imparts knowledge of manipulation, not of the things themselves. As we go about striking things with a hammer to see what they look like after they've been crushed, what we're really learning about is crushing, and very little else. But in approaching the postmodern problem and the postmodern paradigm, many people often find themselves in a position of absolute despair over one's capacity to draw conclusions, and this is problematic. And this, incidentally, is where many of the reactions against postmodernism gain their weight and gain their momentum, much as I suspect yours do. The idea that we can know nothing, that we can learn nothing, that we are utterly incapable of knowledge, is a dangerous conclusion. And ultimately, I think, a ridiculous one. And here, I think we may perhaps agree. However, the problem described in postmodernism, or rather the general postmodern malaise, is not that we have no knowledge, but rather that our knowledge is relative. And here, once again, we find that we are not so much proposing a new idea as hearkening back to an old one. You reference Plato frequently in this series of videos, and so I would hope that you are familiar with Plato. And above and beyond his simple social commentaries, are familiar with his more metaphysical arguments as well. the idea of transcendence, transcendent ideals. And while these are paradigms that are, I would say, poorly explained in Plato's own work, Plotinus goes on to develop them to a great deal of sophistication and a great degree of sophistication.